Well, we're moving on to a new subject, which is track plans and layout plans in general. This week we're working on the basic shape of the railroad. Not the track plan necessarily, but the actual shape of the railroad and how that fits your environment. Last week we made a transition from wiring the railroad. We've been talking about electrics for quite a while, into the track plan, because once you get into block design, it's all about how the electrics fit your track plan. And so what we need to do now is just move on to designing your railroad. What is your track plan, and therefore what is your benchwork, and what is your benchwork shape? Now this is probably the most basic model railroad that you can build, and yet I'd be willing to bet that probably more than half of all the model railroads that have ever been built have been built to this exact benchwork shape and some kind of similar track plan to this. This because plywood is sold as 4x8 sheets, and the easiest way to build a model railroad is to go to the hardware store, grab a 4x8 sheet of plywood and set it on a table and start laying track. Now there are several problems with a layout design like this. The most obvious of which is trains don't go around in a circle like this. Race cars go around in a circle like this, but trains tend to go from one place to another, not around in a circle. So a much more interesting track plan would be one where the train feels like it started in one place and went to another place, not just around in a circle. And generally speaking, that requires a very large railroad. This is the track plan for the great big huge railroad that the O-scale guys, Steve and Al and Don and myself, built in the MRS hobby shop. And it was really huge, O-scale railroad, and the stairway accessed the room through the middle of the room, so that made it possible to run this oval of track all the way around the outside of the room. But it's still basically that same track plan of the 4x8 sheet of plywood. It's just huge. Now let's talk about another problem with the 4x8 sheet of plywood. I've built my first couple of railroads when I was much, much younger with this kind of railroad built on a sheet of plywood. And you quickly realize that there's this other problem with that, and that's accessing the track all the way around. If you tuck this thing up against a wall, which is tempting to do because it already occupies a fair amount of floor space, you cannot get to a lot of the track. So what a lot of people will do is put it on legs with wheels so that they can pull it out into the middle of the room when they're using it, and then tuck it up against the wall when they're not using it. But when you think about it, it's even though it's only a 4x8 sheet of plywood, the floor space that it's taking up is gigantic because of that problem of being able to access all of your railroad. So even though this is probably the most popular size and shape of a railroad, when you think about it, it's visually not that attractive and functionally not that well thought out. It's taking up way too much space for what it is. So let's talk about another style of railroad. This is the shelf railroad. And the immediate problem that jumps out, and I've had all kinds of people say, I would never have one of those because I want to just turn my trains on and have them go around. Sure, I get that, but you can get an immense amount of enjoyment out of a shelf railroad. You can run your trains back and forth and move things around and switch onto cars and switch off of cars and so on. And if you're running, highly detailed models, especially using something like DCC, this can just be a tremendous amount of fun actually running the trains with your hand on the controls at all times. And the advantage is it's much more like a real railroad. It's going from one place to another, and it isn't taking up very much space at all to do that. And another advantage here is that you can reach any part of this because it's only, a foot or so wide, maybe 2 feet wide. Just standing there without a ladder or stretching or doing anything, you can just reach clear to the back of the railroad. You can put your hands on any part of the track to re-rail a train or do any detailing or any work you want to do, the entire railroad is easily accessible. I was truly one of those people who said, I want to be able to run my trains continuously, until I ran into this shelf railroad. It used to travel around to all of the big train shows. It was built by PBL Brass Locomotives. They build models in SN3, and they're big promoters of SN3. At any rate, they built this wonderful model of Chama, New Mexico in SN3 to demonstrate their models, and they would let people come in and run this, and you could run trains back and forth through Chama. And if you were familiar with Chama, as we are, and you love Chama as we do, it felt so much like actually being there, only it was this small shelf railroad that you could easily fit in most houses. Most people could fit something like this in their home. The total size is 18 by 2 feet. But one of the great advantages is it could be tucked right up on a wall. It could be hung on a wall. It's because it's a shelf. And this is a very large scale. This is S scale. If you wanted to do something in a smaller scale, HO or N, you can still do a tremendous amount even on a shelf that's only, say, 1 foot by 8 feet. And most people could fit something that small hanging on a wall in their home somewhere. So this is a track plan we looked at last week. It's a basic shelf railroad. In HO, this is only 8 by 1 feet. And so this is just kind of an arbitrary track plan we threw at it, but it's point to point with no turning. This is the track plan we have at Garage Mahal. And if you look at it, it's fundamentally this same kind of idea. It's a point-to-point railroad, fundamentally a gigantic shelf that's about 300 feet long, with no capability for continuous running. You can run from one end of this to the other end of this. It does have the ability to turn your trains around when you get to the far end. At this end, there's a Y where you can turn just the locomotive, and at this end, there's a turntable, which will only turn a locomotive. And so that's the only ability to turn the train around and go back the other way. So while it's huge, both in terms of its footprint and its scale, half of it being outdoors and it being a G and F scale railroad, it's still fundamentally a shelf railroad, a point-to-point shelf railroad. So if you absolutely want to have continuous running, to be able to turn a train on and have it just go around and around, there's a variation on the shelf railroad called a dogbone railroad. And you can see that by having it wide at both ends and just a narrow shelf in the middle, you can put loops on either end that will allow you to continuously run a train. So basically what we've done is cut our 4x8 sheet of plywood in half and then put a shelf between the two halves. And as long as the outer 2 feet of each end is accessible and not tucked up against a wall, the whole rest of the railroad can be tucked up against a wall, even tucked into corners at both ends, as long as you can access the outer 2 feet of the loop. And at that point, it's just like operating a shelf railroad. You can easily reach any part of this railroad. And you can come up with some pretty complicated track plans. When we were talking about electrics and automatic reversing loops, we talked about how you can set up this kind of a railroad with a single track main and have automatic reversing loops at both ends. But most people will opt to have a double track down through the middle so they don't have to deal with that. And at that point, it's sort of like having a gigantic 4x8 sheet of plywood with an oval on it, only that it's got a lot more advantages. And there's no requirement that that center section just be a straight shelf along a wall. It can go around a bend like this. We call this a folded dogbone. And this can get quite elaborate depending on how you want to fold that. But as long as you keep the ends open so that you have a walkway all the way around the middle and on the very ends of these loops, this black area here, then the whole rest of the railroad can easily be tucked up against a wall or into corners, and you have a huge, very functional railroad that's also very easily accessible. If you have the space in your room, you can also fit a peninsula off of the shelf part of the railroad up to 4 feet, even 5 feet wide, and you can still easily access the very center of the peninsula from either side by just simply reaching across. And now you can come up with a very elaborate track plan that utilizes the peninsula, assuming that you have the floor space to handle this. But again, looking at the classic 4 by 8 foot railroad where you can't tuck it up against a wall and you need to be able to get all the way around it on all 4 sides, if we overlay that on top of the Peninsula Railroad, you can see that the gigantic Peninsula Railroad is taking up almost no more floor space than the classic 4 by 8 sheet of plywood. Karen and I run into people all the time who say, "Oh, I wish I could build a model railroad, but I just don't have the space for it." And I say, come on, everybody has space. If you even have just 4 feet of wall that you can hang a shelf on, you can create a highly detailed 4 foot long by 1 foot, 1.5 feet wide railroad that takes up no space at all and is still enormously fun to build and to operate. And if you have 16 feet of wall that you can dedicate to your model railroad, take that sheet of plywood and just cut it in half and build yourself a 2 foot wide by 16 foot long railroad that can just be amazing. So now that we have a couple of the most basic shapes of railroads in our little bag of tricks here, we're going to be going forward with different track planning ideas to utilize this space that we have carved out of our living environment and now to create a really fun and interesting and fully operational model railroad. And of course you want to follow along with that. So if you're not a subscriber to the channel, please subscribe by clicking on the upcoming blue button. Zoink! Right there, the blue button. Well, we're not sure how you found this video on the internet. We hope you didn't find it boring. And Karen and I will see you here on Sunday with some of that kind of foolishness. We'll see you then. Bye-bye.